Everyone, please rise. Good afternoon and welcome everyone to the Cade Museum for this April 20th meeting of the Rotary Club of Gainesville. My name is Tom Collette, your Sergeant at Arms. Again, if you're watching this after the fact on YouTube, that's a $5 violation right there, President. Wasn't yours? Find out who it was. If you're watching this after the fact on YouTube, register your participation by sending an email to us at info@rotarygainesville.org. We begin today, as we always do in our meetings here, with a song, maybe even a joke, and the pledge from the one, the only, Pete Enwall.
The joke is unlikely. I recognize that. You can tell that I'm getting a little stale because people have started giving me a lot of material. And so I got one from Joe Anderson that just, I'm going to tell you. Did you hear about the chameleon who couldn't change colors? He suffered from reptile dysfunction. Well, anyway. Okay, so I also heard one of those lawyer ads on TV, you know, from Sokoloff or somebody like that, that said that if you have to wear both a mask and eyeglasses, you may be entitled to condensation. Please give me more materials. Okay, we're gonna sing "My Country 'Tis of Thee" today, but we're gonna sing it in memory of Prince Philip, who passed away. We're going to sing it to the tune of "God Save the Queen." My country 'tis of thee, sweet land of liberty, of thee I sing. Land where my fathers died, land of the Pilgrim's pride, from every mountainside, let freedom ring. Join me in pledging allegiance to our flag. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you, Pete. And for future notice, you're allowed only one joke per meeting, okay? Up next, we have our invocation, today offered via Zoom by Kevin Thorpe. Kevin.
May we pray. Lord, we are gratefully honored by this day. We thank you for all that it represents and all that will unfold. Thank you especially for today's presentation. We are excited in advance about its content. Continue to bless what we do and what we say as an organization. It is for your sake and for your glory that we pray. Amen.
Thank you, Kevin. If you have a guest, please you and your guest remain standing. If you're visiting a Rotarian, please remain standing.
Thank you. I have a guest today on Zoom. I believe has attended Charles Cobb. He's a member of the board at the Matheson, but he's on the faculty at the Natural History Museum, Department of Anthropology. He's an endowed chair, sits in an endowed chair there. Charlie Cobb.
Thank you. I'm Don Nussmeyer. I'm a visiting Rotarian from Lake Oswego, Oregon. And I think I'm in the process of transitioning to Gainesville and would hope to become a member one of these days. Thank you.
Harvey Baxter, visiting Rotarian from Baker County Rotary Club.
And welcome to each and every one of you to our meeting today. We now turn the meeting over to your president. Please welcome Matthew Brady.
Thank you all. It's great to be here. Don's great to have you back. Don's visited several times with us, so good to see you again. Pete, Joe, no fine. Just save your money for copay, okay? That was about as bad as Pete's joke. On a serious note, passing along some information if you have not seen. Pam Carpenter's mother passed away Saturday night. She lived in North Carolina. She was an amazing 101. So, yeah, remember Pam and family, please, in this week. And then also received word April 1st, a few weeks back, a longtime former member, Laurie Philpott. I think he was a member from like 1964 to around 2017, officially ended his membership, but passed away a few weeks ago. So remember his family as well. So on the business side of things, remember next week, we've had 3 weeks notice. We'll have some small bylaw changes we'll vote on. And so we'll do that here in person next week real quick. And also for those on Zoom, be able to participate in that. So glad everybody's here. We did break our streak of live speakers, but we do, I think, have a great presentation today. And for that, I'm going to ask Miss Jenny Van Hart if she'll introduce today's Zoom speaker. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. I am excited about today's speaker. Dr. Joshua Bell is the Curator of Globalization, Director of Recovering Voices Program, and Acting Director of the National Anthropological Archives at the National Museum of Natural History, which is part of the Smithsonian. Dr. Bell is a cultural anthropologist combining ethnographic fieldwork with research in museums and archives to examine the shifting local and global network of relationships between persons, artifacts, and the environment. His interests are in materiality, the politics of representation, transforming political economies and ecologies, as well as issues around the production and understanding of history. He has been involved in field work since 2000 with communities in the Purari Delta of Papua New Guinea, documenting the social, economic, and environmental transformations in the wake of regional resource extraction. Since 2011, he's been on a collaborative project in the extraordinarily intimate and global relations materialized in cell phones in Washington, DC and beyond. This work is complemented with ongoing archival and museum-based research in Australia, Europe, Papua New Guinea, and the United States. At the National Museum of Natural History, he carries out research on the Oceanic collections with a particular emphasis on the Melanesian materials, New Caledonia, New Guinea, Solomon Islands, and Vanuatu, as well as the 8,000 million feet of film that compose the Human Studies Film Archives at the National Anthropological Archive. Joshua is a founding member of the Recovering Voices, which connects communities to Smithsonian collections in the effort to support language and knowledge documentation, sustainability, and revitalization. As part of Recovering Voices, he co-directs the annual Mother Tongue Film Festival, which celebrates language and cultural diversities through showcasing films and filmmakers from around the world. And it's through this collection, this festival, that I discovered Joshua and connected with him, because there are several movies or several shows that are from New Zealand. It's featuring the Māori language. Joshua is also the director for the Summer Institute of Museum Anthropology, a summer course funded by the National Science Foundation, which teaches graduate students how to effectively engage with museums. He also works with interns and fellows, helps supervise PhD theses, and teaches at the George Washington University. So he's not busy at all. He's got nothing to do. He was just waiting for me to contact him to speak to our club today, and I'm very excited to hear him. Over to you, Joshua.
Good afternoon, everyone. Can you all hear me? Yeah, great. All right, I'm going to thank you. I should have told Jenny to read the shorter bio, but it's always daunting to hear about what one does. Well, greetings to you all, and I realize that this is unusual circumstance, so I'm sorry that I can't be with you in person, but I hope that actually being able to do Zoom allows you to actually have a wider range of speakers. So I really appreciate having the opportunity to talk to you all. I want to begin by acknowledging two things. One, I am Zooming to you from my basement, and I have 3 kids, so we may get interrupted, hopefully not. But I also wanted to acknowledge the Piscataway and other traditional custodians of the Potomac region on whom my home in Washington, D.C. and the Smithsonian rests. And I do that because if you've been following kind of trends within museums, there's an ongoing effort to kind of recognize Native North Americans, and just also the ways in which museums need to do a better work with connecting to communities. And that in part is what I wanted to talk to you about, is some of the work that I've been doing with colleagues at the Asia Pacific American Center at the Smithsonian and elsewhere to kind of connect around a series of canoes. So that's what I'm going to talk about. And my title really comes from this comment that Aliko Bomata, who is a collaborator of mine, a Hawaiian canoe builder, likes to say a lot, which is canoes bring people together. And I'm going to use this story to think about what the Smithsonian and at the National Museum of Natural History in particular is doing to kind of connect with communities, and then use this one particular example of this project around 2 canoes that are in museums. And I'm hoping that if you haven't come to DC to go to the National Museum of Natural History, that you will want to do so as soon as we are open, because we are not currently not open. So as many of you know, the Smithsonian is the world's largest complex of museums. We have about 19 world-class museums and galleries, garden and a zoo. I happen to work within natural history, which has its origin point in 1910, and that's a view of the inside of our museum, which I haven't seen for several months. And I think one thing to say, actually, I'll go back for a second. One thing that's notable about our museum is that we are the National Museum of Natural History, besides being your museum, right? We are a publicly funded as well as partially privately funded museum, but we are the US's National History, or Natural Museum of Natural History. We have the largest set of collections within the Smithsonian. So we house 146 million objects that range from small insects to giant canoes and everything in between, asteroids, et cetera, and you name it. And that is part of our call, is to kind of be stewards for this materials, because these collections and all their diversity really give us insight not only into the past and the present, but also in the future, and thinking about what is going to happen in the next 50, 100 years with humans, but also wider issues of biodiversity. And I think one of the challenges at the museum is to kind of get the public to understand that mission, that we are research driven and that our collections are there for use, and to think about what the challenges to our planet currently are, and to ourselves, right? Because they're not divorced from individuals. This is an image taken from my field work. Jenny mentioned I've done work since 2000 in the Prairie Delta of Papua New Guinea, which is on the south coast. And one of the markers of my work there has been just kind of working with communities to think through the impact of logging. And I use this image, though, to, a lot of people are very aware of the kind of threats to biodiversity that we face at a planetary scale. But I guess the question is, how many of you are aware of issues facing language and cultural diversity, right? And not that they're on par, but there are issues faced by communities around the world regarding linguistic issues. And it's estimated that, in the end of the century, about half of the languages are spoken, or around 7,000 will be silent. And this is an issue, I know there's, particularly within the US, there's a lot of rhetoric around, well, wouldn't it be better if we all speak English? And certainly it would make perhaps communication easier. But, again, I can't ask questions of you all, but I wonder how many of you speak different languages. And this issue of language diversity actually is very important because, like biodiversity, this diversity helps kind of us be more resilient as a species, if you will, but also language and cultural knowledge are humanity's archive of what it means to be human. It also gives us insight into a variety of things, whether it be issues around biodiversity, issues around what the human mind is capable of. So it's not just a kind of, we need to speak more languages, but these languages are important on many different levels. And it was really in thinking about these issues and the kind of threat for languages currently around the world that some colleagues and I in 2009 started the program Recovering Voices, which is an effort to connect communities to collections. And we do that in principle to kind of help communities. And this, obviously, we're not working with communities that aren't interested in doing this work. We're working with communities who either apply to us or working through individual curators who are interested in accessing the 3 million cultural objects that we have, as well as the wide ranging of archival materials, and accessing them to both think about revitalization, but also thinking about how they can document knowledge systems so that they can either continue to make artistic traditions or understand them better. So for the last 10 plus years, we've been actively bringing communities in to engage with collections. And that's been particularly useful. And so part of it, the work of Recovering Voices, if you will, is to kind of how to make our collections more active, how to take the 8 million feet of moving images that we have and connect them to communities that are interested. And so how to transform that view of the Smithsonian that some people have of it being the nation's attic to kind of transforming it into being the nation's meeting ground where different communities can come, access material for various ends. So that's my kind of, if you will, background to Recovering Voices and kind of the background to how this project around these canoes emerged. So let me turn to them. Now, as many of you may know, the Smithsonian was founded in 1846 through a bequest of James Smithson, who is an Englishman. And actually at the founding of the Smithsonian, our kind of one of our great founding collections was the collection that was created by the U.S. Exploring Expedition, which was an expedition that was the U.S.'s first scientific voyage around the world, circumnavigation from 1838 to 1842. And it was through this collection, and they collected a wide variety of cultural objects as well as biological materials, as minerals, etc. That this expedition is kind of where the story I want to tell begins, because it was during the visit to New Zealand, or Aotearoa, New Zealand, that Commodore Wilkes, he collected some tattooed heads. And this was illegal at the time. He did it knowing it was illegal, and he brought it back. Thankfully, he wrote about it in his diary. And it was kind of known to be it was brought to our attention by Te Papa, colleagues who run the National Museum there, and expressed desire to bring these ancestral remains back to Aotearoa, New Zealand. So in actually 2016, I was privileged enough to participate in this event. And this was an event in terms of, at Natural History, we had a ceremony in which the remains of these individuals were given back to Te Papa, or given back to the state and brought back to New Zealand in May of 2016. Now, repatriation, as you can imagine, I think there's a lot of misunderstandings about repatriation. I'm actually very positive about it because, as I'm hopefully will show you through the story, I'm going to continue to tell you, repatriation, this kind of giving materials and righting wrongs, if you will, from the past. And clearly with Wilkes, there was, it was in British law that the collection of these remains was illegal, and he did it anyway. That righting these wrongs actually can lead to new collaborations, and that's exactly what happened, because following this repatriation, and it was the National Museum of Natural History's first international repatriation, and I should say that natural history and the Smithsonian has been doing repatriation within the US ever since the passing of the 1990 National Grave and Repatriation Act. But this was slightly different because it was international. But it was in the wake of that actually we were approached by the New Zealand government, the New Zealand Maori Arts and Crafts Institute in particular, about whether we would host Tuku Ihu, Living Legacies, which is a dynamic traveling exhibit that's been in the US now within DC, where we were privileged enough to host it for 10 days. It was also over in Los Angeles and has traveled the world. And if you've been to natural history, this is the north entrance of the museum, the kind of least glamorous entrance. This is not on the mall, but facing north. But every morning for the duration of this, these performers would transform our museum into a marae, or one of these traditional meeting houses that the Maori have. They also did performances within the rotunda twice a day. And so for 10 days, our museum was really transformed, if you will, into a small New Zealand, Maori New Zealand. And this was really remarkable. It invoked a lot of feelings. I've never been involved with something that has been so joyful. And part of that, there was a demonstration and creation of a waka, or canoe as it's known in Maori, which then was gifted to us. And so part of what happened over the 10 days was actual craftsmen, James Ricard and James Iraru, actually were making this waka for the public, in front of the public, and which was a really wonderful event. And as part of that, Tua Tehere Tangata, and I apologize for my Maori pronunciation, I need to work on it, is still incurious. So if you come to the National Museum, you will see this canoe, or waka. There it is. It's modeled on a 15th century canoe. So it's a bit of a hybrid river canoe with finials and prows that invoke larger war canoes. But this is a canoe that's now in our space and has become a wonderful lynch point or meeting point for New Zealanders. And we've done a variety of things around this canoe, which I'm happy to answer questions about. But it was during this 2017 visit that as part of my role as a curator at the museum, I'm always interested in taking visitors into the collections. And so we went, the bunch of the Maori carvers, we went into the museum's collections out in Suitland, Maryland, and I showed them this Hawaiian outrigger canoe, which is the second canoe of my story. And this was a canoe that was gifted to us by Queen Kapiolani in 1887. It came into the museum in 1880, and I'm going to get more into the canoe in a bit. But this canoe immediately sparked interest. It is the oldest known Hawaiian outrigger canoe in a museum. When it was donated to our museum, it was said to be 100 years old. So it's about 232 years old now. And James, who's right here, immediately after seeing it, got on the phone and ended up calling one of his colleagues, Alika, who I mentioned to you earlier in terms of the quote, "Canoes bring people together," and, ended up talking to him on WhatsApp and said, you and your father have to see this. Do you know this about this canoe? And it was through that call that we really began the Va'a project, which Va'a is the Hawaiian word for canoe. And through Recovering Voices have been working since 2017 to really think through intergenerational knowledge around canoe building, and the understanding of that skill. And that's something that I've been doing closely with Alika Bomata, a Hawaiian canoe builder. His father, until his death, sad passing last year, Ray Bumata, as well as James, who I've mentioned, and then Kaleva Korea, who's a curator of Hawaiian and Pacific American at APAC. And one of the things that my role as a curator at Natural History has been to kind of help to assemble some of the materials that we have both in our archives and outside of them about the story of how this canoe got into our collection. So I mentioned that when the canoe was gifted to us, it was said to be the oldest Hawaiian canoe, or at least 100 years old. If one goes into various newspaper accounts at the time, this gift was a big deal. It was a diplomatic gift. It arose in the wake of Queen Kapiolani's visit to Washington, D.C. in 1887. And she came to the Smithsonian, we're told, in the newspaper accounts, and kind of noticed that there was no Hawaiian canoe. And so she offered to give one. She also met with the president at the time. And this was part of the diplomatic mission, if you will. Hawaii, the Kingdom of Hawaii was still independent. 1898 was when the US annexed Hawaii. And so this was part of a kind of diplomatic gift. The canoe came, and if we look in our archives, this is what the canoe looks like when it's not in storage. This is an unknown member of staff at the National Museum, which was the kind of precursor to the National Museum of Natural History, sitting in the National Mall in the canoe with it fully done up. And there is, with the sail, and then actually a small Hawaiian flag in the back. We know that this, again, hoping you've been to the museum, this piece was originally in our Hall of Boats, which was in the Arts and Industry building, which is on the mall and was the second building at the Smithsonian. Here's a picture of that. This building was built in 1879. It was part of display of the centenary of the US. And it has gone through some hard times, but the building's actually in the process of being renovated and will be reopened soon, which is great. So we know that the canoe was in this area right up in here. And we have some historical photographs. This is from 1930s. So the canoe was actually stored, and it's right down here. So not something that you could easily see. Here's a close-up of it. P, we believe, is for Polynesia. And this was a way in which canoes were stored as part of a kind of typology of technology. The canoe was actually then transferred to anthropology, where it then went into MSc. Prior to our work on the canoe, Queen Kapiolani's canoe was displayed in 2004 by my senior colleague, Adrian Kepler, who's the curator for the Pacific at our museum, as part of her show, Hawaiian Treasures. And it was actually during that period that a lot of conservation work was done, because as you can imagine, with a canoe that's 232 years plus, made out of wood, it needed some TLC regarding, the prows had suffered some damage. And so a lot of work was done. And actually, the outriggers were made anew because the original outriggers had fallen apart. The binding was redone. And so our project, if you will, kind of came into being in the wake of this work. And so what did we do? Well, in 2018, part of what we did was team up with our museum's digital experts. And you've probably seen there was a big splash a month ago with Verizon working with us to do these VR experiences, or AR, augmented reality, where you can have the lunar module through your phone. And so there's been a big push to digitize. And so we teamed up actually with the University of South Florida, their cultural heritage and library group, to actually do the scanning work with handheld scanning. So that was done over the course of a week. And that created, we now have a 3D rendering, which I'll come back to. And that was really important. And part of as you can imagine, with cultural objects, one has to be aware of a lot of cultural sensitivities. But in this case, this canoe was a gift to the Smithsonian. And so part of what our project has been designed to do is to kind of how to keep this gift of the canoe to help it continue to travel. How do we kind of transcend the storeroom and use this canoe as a vehicle to educate people about the history of the canoe itself, but also the history and the importance of canoe making traditions within Oceania. So following that, for 2 weeks, Ray and Alika Bomata, who are pictured in the picture on the right, came at the same time. James and 2 of his students actually came from New Zealand, and we re-rigged the canoe. And so part of it was a very tactile investigation of the canoe. We had long conversations about this section, which is a repair job that was done. There's also, and so part of the work I've been doing is actually to, if you will, do an archaeology of the canoe to try to figure out when that repair was possibly done, because there was a lot of conversations about whether repair was done by Hawaiians or possibly by people like myself, Haoles, as Hawaiians refer to European people of European descent. There's also the issue of the paint. We don't know when the paint was done. I've had some thermoluminescence work done on the paint, and we know that the paint has a high level of cobalt in it, which is a particular period of marine paints. So that was presumably done in the museum. So part of what we're trying to do is to kind of unpack that history, as well as to kind of understand the canoe better. We also, through this visit, realized that most likely that sail that I showed you was actually probably an add-on to the canoe, because this was not really a sailing canoe. So one possible narrative is that actually the canoe was, if you will, gussied up as part of it being gifted to the Smithsonian. I mentioned this, but one of the other aspects was this intergenerational learning. And so re-rigging the canoe was a way in which the 2 groups, Maori and Hawaiian, could talk about different rigging styles. And we also then, over the course of their work, and this is the canoe re-rigged, also did series of kind of Zoom virtual learning sessions with school groups, both in Aotearoa, New Zealand, and then in Hawaii, to kind of work through that. But the story didn't stop there. And so one of the things, having engaged with this canoe, my colleague Kaleva Korea, through the American Women's History Initiative, which is a new initiative at the Smithsonian to highlight the work of women, got a grant to engage with Alika and Ray again in Hilo, Hawaii, where during the Merry Monarch Festival, they actually worked to make 2 replicas of the canoe. And part of this was a chance to actually teach women how to carve canoes, which traditionally was not something that women in Hawaiian society or among the Maori did. I was able, through funding through Recovering Voices and an endowment that I was very lucky to receive through Whitney and Betty McMillan, to support then the participation of Hemi or James and his students again. So in 2019, we kind of reconvened as a group to build or start building 2 actual models or replicas of the canoe. And then as part of that, James and his group actually came to Natural History in 2000, in May, to actually revisit Tuitahere Tangata Waka to check on it, because there had been some cracks that developed. And so I mention this because one of the things that we're working on at the Smithsonian is how, through this waka and other things, to kind of make our collections less static, but more dynamic, and recognize the kind of living quality that a lot of objects have for different people. Now, following that, in 2019 in November, and it feels like yesterday, James convened the Rata or Canoe Symposium, which was part of a larger project, Tua 250. And that was kind of an event in Aotearoa, New Zealand that kind of marked the arrival of Europeans, specifically through Captain Cook, and thinking about that intercultural exchange. So that last year marked a whole series of events, or 2019, yeah, into 20, to mark that anniversary, if you will. And so part of it was James convened several groups, 3 groups, in fact, well, 4 groups, in fact, Tahitian, Maori group, some of his students, Hawaiian group, Alika and some of others, and then, if you will, another Maori group that did a digital canoe. And so over the course of a month or several months, 2 months, 4 canoes came into being, one of which was a digital print inspired by Queen Kapiolani's canoe. So we took the digital print that we scanned through in collaboration with folks from University of Southern Florida, and Derek Kawaiti, who's a lecturer at Victoria University of Wellington, actually did a full-scale, life-size, if you will, print of Queen Kapiolani's canoe, and you can see him here actually fabricating it. And that was an important kind of way of thinking through traditions. I think too often a lot of people, when they think of indigenous communities around the world, they think of them kind of in the past and using maybe traditional tools. And so one of the aspects of this was to demonstrate the role of the digital. Not that the digital will replace adzes or chainsaws for that matter, but show rather the spectrum of making and technologies, and also show the importance of museum collections. And one of the things I think that was really important for me as a curator at the Smithsonian was where we were in the Bay of Russell, in the Bay of Islands on the North Island. We were across the bay from Waitangi, where the original Treaty of Waitangi was signed, which is a historic treaty in 1840 that really set up relationships between Maori and the British Crown. But that's where also during that treaty signing in 1840 was where the US exploring expedition actually came. And then they collected the human remains back then in that area. So we were in effect, if you will, back to the start of the story, where the repatriation was created. So it was a very actually emotional event, because it was that repatriation which really brought us together and brought us to this canoe. There are a series of videos actually that came out, which I should have sent to Jenny, that kind of elaborate this event, and they do much better justice than I can verbally, which I'm happy to send for her to share with you. But then, if that was the kind of most recent, what we've done now in the wake of the pandemic, as you can imagine, the Smithsonian's been shut, and we haven't been able to bring any communities as we normally do into the museum to engage with collections. So my colleague Gwen Isaac has begun what we call RV at Home, which is a way of taking our collections and kind of doing more digital engagement. And so as part of that, we started 3 trial runs or 4 trial run projects, one of which was centered around the Hawaiian groups that I had already been working with. And so we reached out to Alika and his wife, Alexis Chang, who's a canoe carver in her own right. She was a student of Ray Bomata, Alika's father. And we picked up those 2 canoes that they had begun in 2019, and they worked to refinish it in 2020 in December at the Kaua Theater in Waimea. And as part of that, there was, socially distanced video streaming of Alika carving, as well as answering questions on Facebook Live. And then there was an art installation that students in the region created, art projects such as the one I'm showing you here. We're all in the same boat to kind of really think through the kind of various ways in which canoes can serve as both physical ways of being together, but also more metaphoric ones. And so this project is ongoing, and we're working right now to actually set up the second phase, which will be the kind of the setting up of the outrigger and the lashing of the canoe. And then once it's done, it will be donated to a charter school in that region. The final thing I should mention is that we are working on actually presenting in June, in honor of Queen Kapiolani's birthday, the digital rendering of this. And so you will be able to go online soon and be able to examine an annotated version of this canoe and learn about its history and the work we've been doing and the kind of history of it. And then as part of that, you'll be able to actually use it AR and put it in your living room and explore it. And so with that, I'll stop. So I think we have about 10 minutes for questions. So I'm happy to take questions. Jenny, I'm not sure what the easiest way is to do that, but I'll stop sharing my screen so I can see everyone.
Hello, this is Tony Barr. I'm interested, are any of these war canoes? I guess they were very aggressive people in the Fiji Islands, I understand.
Well, I mean, war is perhaps endemic to the human condition, unfortunately. Maori certainly had their traditions of warfare, as did the Hawaiians. These canoes, none of them were war canoes, but there were particular war canoes that across the Pacific were made. And Fiji actually is a great example. Their kind of long voyage and war canoes were actually giant 2 double-hulled canoes. So quite amazing boat building achievements.
Robert Mounts, one of a couple of board members of the Matheson History Museum here in Gainesville. I would just like to let you know that in our lobby, we have a 1,500-year-old dugout from the Tamukan Indians on display, carbon dated somewhere between 400 and 600 AD. And that museum is now open on Friday and Saturday afternoons from 1 to 4. Thank you for your presentation.
Oh, that's great. I look forward to coming down to see it as soon as I can.
Thank you. Jacob Atem, great presentation. I grew up by the Nile, so I'm very familiar with the canoe. They're significant.
Wonderful.
And unfortunately, during the war, the traditional canoe was kind of disrupted. Now they got the new country. And last July, there was a huge natural disaster, particularly with the Nile. I live by the Nile. So literally the Nile overflooded and there was not enough canoe. People are now trying to revive it. And so it's a significant object that saved life, a matter of life and death. So could you elaborate more on the usage of the canoe, where they were using it like for like surviving, fishing, and also are you interested in other canoeing other than in America? Thank you.
Thanks. It's a great question. Yeah, I love canoes. I have 2 model canoes actually behind me from Papua New Guinea that were gifted to me in my little basement office here. Yeah, canoes, there is the way in which in the Pacific, which as it has been said by Apele Ho'ofa, who was a Tongan scholar, he refers to the Pacific as a sea of islands, right? And so the Pacific is the largest body of water on the planet, and it is home to an incredible seafaring traditions, right? And so canoes played an incredible role and continue to. I think one of the challenges is that, like elsewhere, fiberglass dinghies have taken over as trees that either traditionally were used are not available. But people use canoes for all aspects, from leisure activities to fishing to warfare, etc. And to some extent, they still are used. Within the Hawaiian Islands, canoes are, you see traditional canoe builders most often are actually employed making racing canoes. And that's something that actually has emerged where there's paddle racing. And you see that play out also in Aotearoa, New Zealand. I think New Zealand is slightly different in that Maori communities, each iwi or tribe tends to have, canoes. Everyone has narrative about which canoe their ancestors came to the islands from. And so that plays a very big role. And then different maraes or communities will, not all, will typically have a canoe that they use. And these range in size from smaller canoes to very large traditional war canoes, which are now just used for kind of paddling and kind of competitions as well, but also displays. So people use canoes for a variety of reasons. Yeah, I am interested in canoes from all over. I think canoes are one of these, dare I say, foundational technologies that's really interesting. And so I'm always interested in not only the kind of ethnobotany of the knowledge that goes into which tree to use and how one has to show respect to the tree, to which tools are used. So I actually have a postdoctoral fellow right now, Chris Irwin, who's doing a fantastic job of doing a survey of all our Pacific canoes. But yeah, I love canoes. And I see Jenny posted a question about what was the tree source for this replica canoe. So the various canoes, so Totora is a particular tree to New Zealand, which was used for the waka that's incurious. And that is an amazing tree. Then in Hawaii, we used albizia, which is actually a tree from New Guinea that was introduced to Hawaii as part of tree plantation system. So trying to create more woods, and is actually now deemed to kind of be an invasive species. And so the state is very, very happy to have albizia trees cut down. It's a softer wood, very fast growing, which is why it was like looked at for plantations. Now, traditionally in Hawaii, koa, which is a slower growing hardwood, and a protected species would have been used. So it's harder to get permits for using that. Another question from Jenny is, canoes watertight and are they taken into the water? So the canoe in Curious or the waka is not watertight because it's actually interesting. It's actually two hulls bound together. And they did that because the Totora log was such that it was easier to make it that way. So it's more of a display piece, if you will. Although one of the things that we've been talking about is actually building into Visitor Interactive, actually lashing and relashing the prow of the canoe so that visitors can learn how to lash it. And actually, we thought about it. We could make the canoe seaworthy or let's say Potomac worthy. And to do that, we would need to get, we would need to caulk it so that we could take it out. But that would be actually a lot of fun. I don't know if other questions, yeah.
Thank you for your presentation. I did notice that at the beginning, you were talking about culture and language, and there was a show of, it looked like a group of women at that point in time that appeared to be reading, and I am guessing that was in a particular dialect that might be becoming extinct. And so I wonder if I would suspect that some of the languages that might not be being spoken as often are some of those from Hawaii. And I wonder if you are including the language and demonstrations of that within the context of related displays, or if the language piece is separate, like having many languages all together in a type of display, or not, if it was inclusive in other displays from that area.
Right, that's a great question. Yeah, so the picture I was showing you is from the National Anthropological Archives. So that's at that is a kind of it's the world's largest archives devoted to anthropology. It also has the largest archive of Native North American languages, which has its history that goes back to the Bureau of American Ethnology, which the Smithsonian founded in 1879 to study Native North Americans. In terms of language, I mean, I would say that you cannot take language out of the discussion here. Hawaiian has a very long history. When missionaries kind of entered the islands in 1820, and particularly following the overthrow of the Hawaiian kingdom, Hawaiian language, like many native languages, was actually kind of actively discouraged. And so the fact that there are speakers of Native North America or Native Hawaiian is actually a testament to the Hawaiian community and the revitalization efforts there. And so we see that across the US, where some languages have gone dormant, but there is the ability, you know, if the will is there among the community, they can bring it back. Now, in the case of the Waka, if I understood you, I put a link in the discussion for the Zoom, which I routinely every year, it's been disrupted by the pandemic, take interns from Auckland University of Technology. And so I had one fantastic intern whose stay was disrupted by the pandemic, and should it not have been, what we would have done is actually worked on a display around the Waka in Curious, so the canoe, the first canoe that I started speaking about. And the goal of that was to create a display that incorporated knowledge about totoras, tree species, what Waka means for Maori culture, as well as linguistic, how to say things. So in lieu of doing that physically, what we did is she created a wonderful virtual set of resources for people to look at. So, you know, within the Smithsonian, we're always thinking about how to represent linguistic diversity, and, you know, and that's an ongoing challenge as well as something we work to do. Hope I answered that well.
One last question. If you said this earlier, I apologize. Is there a timetable for the Smithsonian museums to reopen?
That is the billion-dollar question. I know there's discussion that I just saw in local news, as well as I believe national, that there's discussion of reopening before summer. What that will mean, I'm not sure, but you know, within natural history, there's a discussion of what a limited access would look like. So I think with the rise of vaccinations, people are now more comfortable with exploring that. So I imagine they'll be open soon. There are lots of visitors to DC, like with the cherry blossoms out. We were just passing through downtown, and there's still a lot of people. Sadly, they can't go into the museums yet, but there are a lot of outside things like sculpture gardens that you can look at, etc. And I believe the National Gallery of Art, which is not part of the Smithsonian, is open for limited access, but yeah, so hopefully soon.
Fellow Rotarians, how about a nice hand for our speaker today, Dr. Joshua Bell.
Thank you all.
Thank you, Dr. Bell. I appreciate that. This year, our theme is Rotary Opens Opportunities, and thank you, with the museums being open, giving us a chance to step inside a little bit virtually. You talked about early on that maybe this gave us an opportunity, and we have had a tremendous opportunity, not just across the U.S., but across the pond and other places to bring in speakers. And so thank you for...
So for the rest of us who are on Zoom, thank you all for joining us. And Joshua, thank you so much for your time. We appreciate it very much. Have a great day, everyone.